Do you know what chainsaw to buy when you go into the dealers? Well, it depends on the task you're going to use them for. What are the differences in all of these chainsaws? We're going to give you some information so you'll have some real knowledge about how to choose the right one for your job at home. Today we're going to talk about chainsaws and all the different kinds and what they will and won't do. We're going to give you a bunch of choices and a lot of information. So it's going to be kind of a long subject because there's just a lot of chainsaws out there. So stick with us. One of your newer choices on chainsaws is your battery operated saw. Now everybody's pretty well familiar with the old corded chainsaws. They were kind of light duty versions of a chainsaw that you could trim a few limbs, but you had to drag around the cord everywhere you went, and often those cords got cut in the process of trimming and so forth. New kids on the block are these battery operated. Some of the batteries are large, high voltage, heavy, but they'll do an adequate job on some stuff. Why would you want to choose a battery operated saw versus a gasoline saw? And the real reason is up to you. It depends on the usage you have for the saw. Kind of the difference is the good thing about these saws is you can pull the battery off the charger, stick it in the saw, go out and trim limbs. And as you'll see from some of our charts here, they'll probably run about 40 minutes or so before the battery's dead. But that may be all you need to go trim limbs and cut occasional small tree around the house. This is definitely a homeowner saw. You don't want to go firewood cutting or logging with this kind of saw. It just won't stand up to that kind of work. The bad thing, the only negative thing about a battery operated saw is these very expensive lithium batteries that are good for 2 or 3 years, and then you have to buy another one because lithium batteries go bad, like all batteries, over a period of time. So be prepared for that expense on down the road. The other thing that struck me about these battery operated saws as I researched them, 2 things, is none of the manufacturers of these battery operated saws seem to want you to compare them one to the other. So all their statistics are just way out of whack, and you can't pull them up and really compare them to tell anything about what you're getting from one brand of saw to the other. Very confusing. It seemed like there should be some standard to evaluate these saws by so that you can compare them apples to apples. Right now, there is no comparison looking at the specs. Now I noticed some of my fellow YouTubers have set down whole groups of these battery saws and run tests on them, and they've come up with some recommendations. If you're really thinking about a battery saw, you may want to go look at those but you may not need a saw that's going to sit out there and run 40 minutes. You may want to save money and pay half that and buy a saw that runs 20 minutes before you have to recharge it. It depends on what you're doing with it. Now again, we're talking about homeowner level saws here. The kind you would take out in the backyard and trim a few limbs and maybe cut down a small tree. This is not for heavy duty stuff. Good, dependable, and high-powered ones are a new thing on the market, so I guess they still need some evaluation before you're really going to know a lot about them. I provided a chart with some of the specifications on some of the saws, but boy, it didn't give me enough information to make us an intelligent choice on saws, so I wish you luck on it. One thing some people have done is if they've already got, say, a Makita saw, like drills and so forth, they may go buy a Makita chainsaw just so they can use the same batteries. And that happens, and that's maybe one way to do it. Probably the best way to do it is find a friend with one of these and go over and help him do something and use the saw a little bit and learn about them. See if that fits your bill. But battery operated saws is definitely a new thing. The next group of saws I'm going to talk about is your competition for your battery saws, and that is your lightweight homeowner saws. Burning gasoline. They've been around a while. There's all kinds of sizes. A lot of confusion on these saws about what size saw you need. Again, this whole group that I'm pointing out here is a homeowner grade saw. It's made for occasional use around your property just to clean up and do light work. Some of the heavier homeowner saws will cut you a few sticks of firewood. They are not firewood saws and they're not logging saws. These are lightweight saws for homeowner use. But one thing you have to know about these saws is they're very lightweight, which also means low CC. The only comparison we've got on this whole list of saws here is a common comparison. Some manufacturers give the horsepower saw, but most of them just tell you how many CCs is in there. But as you relate back and forth with some of the specs, you can kind of guess what the horsepower would be for any manufacturer's CC if they don't list it. But we're really talking about a group of saws that are 30 to 45 cc's. On the low end of the scale is this something like this steel 180. A lightweight saw that will cut lightweight wood. From my own personal experience with this saw, this is one I have. If you go much bigger than that on this saw, you're going to be sitting waiting for it to cut. It has a long bar, but it don't have enough horsepower at 31 cc's here to pull that anything much bigger. It's just a very lightweight saw on the low end of the scale. Yet if you're going to go do some heavier work, cut trees this size, you may want something like this mid-range saw, this Echo. Now let me point out something about all of these charts I've listed. And that is that in the US, there is some quality manufacturers of chainsaw that have been in business a while, provides dealers and parts and everything you need to maintain your saw. And those three dealers are Stihl, Husqvarna, and Echo. Now, the last few years, we've been flooded with these Asian knockoffs. Cheap, no dealer network, no parts available, barely even get an instruction manual with them. So if you're looking for a cheap saw, buy one of them, but think of it as a throwaway saw. As soon as you start having problems, don't try to fix it, throw it away and get another cheap saw if that's the path you're going down. I've always thought it was much more economical to buy a quality saw backed up by a dealer that had parts and maintenance if I needed it. Let me talk about that a minute. Why am I qualified to talk to you about chainsaws? I started working in a chainsaw shop and owned chainsaws in 1970, several years ago. And I have done various things in my life, but I have done chainsaws and I went away and come back and worked on them more. When I was running a landscape company, I was using chainsaws all the time. And I was a fireman for a lot of years, and we used a lot of chainsaws for rescue work and ventilation. So I've been around chainsaws most of my working life, and a lot of that is in the shop where I've learned from the manufacturers what they wanted and how to fix things. And then the last 10 years, I have been in the logging sawmill business here. As a retired, that's become my full-time hobby. So I use chainsaws almost on a daily basis of all sizes for different tasks. So I'm not an amateur at this, so maybe my advice is from that experience of years of being around this can help y'all make choices. But back to the subject. If you are looking for a lightweight saw to carry around and cut small limbs and nothing to exceed this size, something like a Stihl 180 or a 30 cc saw may be appropriate for you. But if you're going to get bigger, you better start thinking about a more like a 40cc saw. That has more horsepower, and you can cut bigger limbs or bigger trees. Now, also, one of these charts you kind of need to notice that as soon as you start increasing the cc's or the horsepower of the saw to cut bigger limbs, so does the weight go up. So you may not want to lug around a heavy chainsaw. But if you're really serious about a homeowner saw, my buddy just got through buying this Stihl 250. And that's a powerful little old saw in this homeowner classification. We were out cutting trees the other day, and he broke the thing out. It's new to him, so he was wanting to see what it'd do. So we started cutting trees, and we were cutting 12-inch trees pretty quickly, and he cut the stump off. These 4 trees grew out of one stump, and he cut the whole stump off with that saw. So this is a pretty good little homeowner saw. Again, it's not a firewood saw, it's not a farm ranch saw, but it is just a nice little size. But notice it's up to 45 cc's. So you start getting into pretty good home size, or pretty dependable, powerful homeowner saw at about 40 to 45 cc's. Anything below that, you're looking for just a limb trimming saw. So think of that when you look at this. Now, one thing I'm going to emphasize about the difference between the battery and the gasoline saws. A gasoline saw today, some people in our government thought it'd be a great idea to start mixing ethanol in our gasoline. In case you're unaware of it, ethanol is corn syrup. You ever had a thick jar of corn syrup? Well, they pour that in the gasoline tank, and they agitate it at the spot, and hopefully it'll stay suspended. So you go to the pump and you fill your gas can full of that ethanol gasoline. You come home and you mix up some oil, 2-cycle oil with it so you can run your chainsaw. And then you pour it in your tank and you set the can over. You go cut a little bit, you come back and you just stick your chainsaw up on a shelf. 6 months, 9 months later, you come back and get your chainsaw out and you can't figure out why it won't start. That corn syrup that's in gasoline settles out. It just falls to the bottom and falls and makes a thick goo, jello-like stuff. And in these small size saws, the idle jet on the thing is less than a human hair. It is small, small. It don't take much jello to stop that up, and that comes from that ethanol. So if you buy any of these gasoline saws that I'm going to be talking about, be aware of the ethanol problem on small engines. The only way there's 2 or 3 ways you can deal with that. One is always mix up fresh gas to use. If it's more than 90 days old, pour it out. Now you can pour it in your car, it'll burn your car, it'll have a little 2-cycle oil in it, but it's not enough by the time you dilute it in the whole tank of gas to be a problem. But do not pour gas in these saws that's been sitting around more than 90 days. Also, when you're using a saw and you're going to put it up for storage, pour that gas out, then crank the saw and run it till it's dry. Then put it on your shelf. Next time you need it, put you some fresh gas in it, and you can go back to work. If not, what you're going to find yourself, if you've set it up 60 to 90 days with that mix in the tank, you're going to find yourself having to have the carburetor rebuilt and cleaned maybe once a year to keep this thing running. And you're going to think it's a terrible machine. Well, it's not the machine, it's the gasoline on the thing. Now, you can help yourself with this problem several ways. One of them is some people, like we now have a Buc-ee's here close by that sells ethanol-free gasoline. Buy that for your small engines. It's more expensive, but it's worth not having to deal with the ethanol problem. Another alternative that your chainsaw manufacturers give, both Stihl and Husqvarna have started making little quart cans of pre-mixed fuel that have Sta-Bil in them. Now, this is a good idea even if you're a homeowner and you've mixed up your gas. You can buy a product called Sta-Bil, which stabilizes gasoline. Makes it last longer in the cans, what it does. So I keep that around, and every time I mix up gas, which usually I run through, big 2-gallon jugs of gasoline, more than once a month, but I still put it in there just in case I set something up for a period of time. So Sta-Bil's a good product to add to your gas. You can buy quart cans of it at the dealer and get away from this problem. But as a homeowner, choose a good saw. 30 cc's or 35 cc's is a very lightweight saw. A 40 cc is kind of the middle of the road for a homeowner saw, and it does an adequate job. If you want a little more power, buy a 45 cc saw, and you'll find it will do most of the things around the house in a small property. So there's your choices. Now, one of the things that the manufacturers tell you without telling you how strong a saw is, because there's a little bit of misrepresentation. I read as I was studying this video, one of these manufacturers, I'm not going to mention their name, apparently somebody wrote some literature that had never been in the woods. They said our chainsaw at 35 cc's has a 16-inch bar, and it'll cut a 32-inch tree. What a bunch of garbage. Apparently that person's never had a chainsaw in their hand. The length of the bar has nothing to do with the ability to cut a 32-inch tree, because you got to have an engine big enough to pull it, and a 35 cc engine is not big enough to cut 16 inches of wood at one swipe. It'll just bog down and quit on you. Watch about misrepresentation. Also, don't choose a saw just because it's got a 16-inch bar versus a 14-inch bar. Because unless it's got the horsepower to back that up, it's just something else to get in your way out there that you can't use. One of the things that manufacturers tell you without telling you is the saw blade. I'll line these up here. I want to get one more saw here to show you. What the manufacturer is telling you by the size of saw chain. Now, I'm talking about the actual cutter pieces on the saw. This one happens to have a 3/8, but some of these smaller 30 to 35 cc chainsaws will have 1/4-inch pitch chain. But all of these small homeowner saws have what they call mini chains, and there's there's a lot of names for those mini chains, but what it amounts to is they are 3/8 chain, just like this big chain, and that has to do with the pitch or the distance between the pins. But what they've done is, on a big saw, these cutters cut a big kerf. Well, what they've done is they've narrowed that kerf and made the cutters much smaller. And the smaller the saw, they use even a micro mini, where it's even smaller and smaller. So when you start to cut, you're cutting very little wood with that chain, because the horsepower won't support one of these bigger chains. So you look at a bunch of chainsaws on a shelf, pull the bars together. Look at the size of chain on it. Those little old small chains is telling you ain't got enough horsepower to pull a big chain. So that's a good indication of the power of a saw. And manufacturers have took care of that for you, but they just don't want to put it out there. The claim that a 16-inch saw will cut a 32-inch tree, that's a ridiculous claim. And don't fall for that kind of misadvertising from any of these people. Look to someone for some advice. A lot of times your saw dealers, if you go to a dealer versus go to some box store or grocery store and buy chainsaws, if you go to a dealer, you can actually talk to someone that knows something and give you some advice on this stuff. So, plus they'll work on your saw with it if something's wrong with it. Try supporting the dealer networks. You can get much better equipment and much better advice on them. So anyway, we're going to move on from homeowner saws, which are your 30 to 45 cc saws, on into farm, ranch, and firewood saws. And what that is a bigger saw meant to work harder. One thing about these little homeowner saws. Many years ago, I was sitting in a school from a chainsaw manufacturer, and they started describing these things, and somebody asked them a question because they were so lightweight that how long are these saws supposed to last? And that manufacturer, this is years ago, but I think it still holds true, they're making these things so cheap and for such a lightweight market that they were talking about 30 to 50 hours of operation the saws wore out. They're not made for long. But that, for a homeowner, though, that may be sufficient. Think of it. Do you go out and use a saw maybe an hour this month, and 3 months from now you use it another hour, and this whole year you've run it 3 hours consistently? Well, you can get a lot of years of service out of a saw that has really a short life expectancy because you're just not using it as much. Now, if you're getting into these farm ranch saws or logging saws, you're going out and using those just pretty regularly. These saws will wear out on you quick when you start doing that. They're just not made for long-term, heavy, everyday use. So buy a saw appropriate to your usage. All right, we're going to move on to farm and ranch saws. Farm and ranch or firewood saw is a bigger saw. And they're designed to use much more regularly, where you might go out and use them several hours each week. Depends on the size of your property. If you've got a 2 or 3 acre home, or especially if you got a 5 or 10 acre area, or you got a small ranch or farm, you're going to want to clear out fence rows and dead trees and bigger timber. And you're going to want to use them more regularly just because the property is going to have all those issues that need to be taken care of. So farm ranch saws too, they're heavier duty, bigger horsepower just to get the job done quicker. Most of them too have full 3/8 chisel chains on them. And these saws are basically a 50 to 65 cc type saw, somewhere in that range. 50 cc saws are rare, certainly at the bottom of that range, but they'll do adequate work if you're in no hurry. If you're trying to really get some work done and you want to go out and you want to cut some trees, a 50 cc saw would have trouble cutting trees like this very long, this size. But a 65 cc saw wouldn't have trouble cutting that quite a bit. There's just quite a bit of difference in that little bit of cc growth that will power that saw for you and do a good job. So think about just really how big trees you plan on cutting and choose a saw appropriate. What you'll notice is most of these saws, farm ranch saws, have 16 to 20 inch bars on the thing. And they're again telling you that using a full-size chain on it, that's all the horsepower that they'll pull, but that's going to be adequate. You're not going to be cutting much more. 20-inch trees is a pretty large tree. You're probably not going to cut much more than that. So one thing, though, you will notice, and this is something I failed to point out earlier on battery-operated saws. Battery-operated saws, let me get my chart back out here. Battery-operated saws cost twice what a little homeowner saw does. So if you're going battery-operated, prepare to spend some more money than you would on a gasoline-powered homeowner saw. But, you know, you don't have to deal with the gasoline problem if you do that. But yet, when you go from a homeowner saw to a farm ranch firewood type saw, you start noticing the prices start rising. And they're a reflection of the size of the saw. But these saws aren't little old lightweight cylinder, aluminum cylinder saws. These things, a lot of them have cast iron sleeves in them, and they're made to run for years and years on a daily basis. They're not throwaway saws. Use them a while and they're wore out. These will stay with you. You know, buy new chains, change the filter and the spark plug regularly, keep on trucking. These will do it for you. So they're really adequate for the mid-range of type of chainsawing that you might use. One of the problems you get is you start getting into the weight of them. They weigh more than the homeowner saws, so if you're thinking about a bigger saw, prepare to be lugging that weight around on the thing. Just to get that big engine in there, they had to increase the size of everything, which made it weigh more. So these are really good saws, and for most, what I have described between the homeowner saws and the farm ranch saws, that is probably over 80% of the people that'll ever buy a chainsaw. They need to be in those classifications. Who needs to be in that other, that down here, we're going to get into professional saws that arborists or loggers would use. Well, that's a lot less than 20% of our population that does that kind of work and works a saw every day in a heavy duty situation. Most homeowners or small farm ranch folks will need much smaller saws, and there's not much reason to spend a lot of money on a logger saw if all you're doing is cutting limbs off a tree in the backyard. It's just a real waste of money, and you're getting a really heavy saw to be lugging around, and it's way overpowered for what you're doing. So farm ranch saws, homeowner saws, that's what most of you are going to be looking at. So use some of this information to help make you decisions about which one you need. The next group of saws I want to talk about is your arborist or logger saws, where you're cutting big trees on a daily basis. You're getting up every morning and grabbing 2 of these big chainsaws, and you're going to the woods or out to somebody's house to cut 3 and 4 foot trees, and you're doing it all the time, most of the day, every day. These saws are designed to stay with you for long periods of time. The last saw that I had before I bought this one was a Steel 391, and I used that 12 years before it wore out. So they got a long life, and I was using it regularly. So again, why you want to buy a quality saw, they'll stay with you for periods of time. Just keep them maintained. In this classification, we're really talking about 60cc saws on up. And a 60cc saw is kind of the bottom of it, but you can certainly go out and cut trees in less than 24 inches down. And if you notice, some of these saws don't even tell you that they'll cut much more than that. On the lighter end of the logging saws, the 60cc group of them. Yet you start getting into the 70 and 80cc group of these saws, they'll cut about anything you throw at them. This is a Steel 462, and this is a Steel 660. It's the older version of what is currently 661. Both of them very powerful saws. Both of them have 3/8 full chisel chains on them, and they will cut this wood. Just because the 661 with a 36-inch bar like this one's rigged weighs so much, I use it to cut my big trees. But I don't want to lug it around all day while I'm limbing that tree once it's on the ground. So I'll go back and grab this saw, 24-inch saw, and because it's a few pounds lighter in weight, and you're not dealing with a big long bar in your way that you don't need. So both the saws are great saws. They have their use. There's another saw that I'll show you later, and it's at the very bottom of this logger chart, and it's a Steel 880. That's the biggest saw that Steel makes. And why I need that saw, and I'll get into that in depth later on, is I have a sawmill, and it will cut a 24-inch diameter log. Anything bigger than that, the rails on the side of the saw won't go past the log. So I have to find another way to cut 3 foot and 4 foot wide slabs that I do so much of, tabletop slabs, run across some really large trees in homeowners' properties. Kind of something that's happening, and this is a reflection of experience I've got from being in the landscape business for a number of years. We have been on this green program for years now. And what that basically is all the cities have statues, and the neighborhoods encourage you, as soon as you buy a house on a vacant lot, is to plant a bunch of trees. Well, some of those trees now have been planted there 50, 75 years on some of these older houses. And because they're fertilizing and watering those trees, they have grown to enormous sizes. Well, some people have planted these little saplings 10 foot from their house, and then 50 years later, it's 3 foot diameter and big limbs are about to fall on their house. They just really didn't have a vision of how large that tree gets. So that's why arborists do such a good business, is going out and trimming those oversized trees that nobody anticipated when they planted them that would be that large. So they use some big saws. They have to cut trees in a different manner than loggers do. Loggers are out in the woods, they just let a tree fall. But arborists have to be very careful because there's usually structures or high lines around there. So they'll use big saws on the trunk, but up in the top of the tree, they may be using small saws to limit a limb at a time. So it's just part of the nature that's happening, that we're seeing a lot of enormously large trees in homeowners' property, and they've become a nuisance or a danger to the house falling on it. So they're having to be cut, so the arborists take care of that. Big logger saws, they're heavy. The other thing I might point out is the expense of these saws. If you replace this saw today, this steel 661, that's about a $1,400 saw. Do you really need that kind of saw to work around your property, where you can go buy a farm ranch saw for $500, less than half the price of what this saw costs? Again, know what you're going to use the saw for and work backwards to the saw you need to buy. A lot of people overbuy saws. And one thing about these big saws, just the engines are so big, they are difficult to crank. You're just working against so much horsepower in them. And one of those little hints the manufacturer gives you without really telling you is this has a compression release here. This one has a compression release right here. That's so you can crank them without pulling a cord plumb out of the thing or pulling your shoulder out of socket. They're hard to crank just because they're so big. You really don't want, as a homeowner or a small farmer rancher, trying to deal with one of these big saws just out to cut a few limbs off a tree or cut some firewood. So these saws are for special purposes, heavy duty work, but they'll last a number of years doing that. Now, I told you when we started, I'm going to tell you that less than 10% of our whole population probably needs one of these, because it is for heavy duty work on really large trees. It's going to be used daily. I got one other kind of saw I wanted to show you and talk to you about. Let me get that one. A lot of time professional arborists will have one of these saws. And here on this bottom chart, they're usually called in-tree saws. And they're made for a tree climber that's crawling up on the top of a tree, an arborist. It's crawling up on the top of a tree, and he needs both hands to work with. And then later on, when he starts to cut the tree, he's holding on the tree with one hand, and he's running the chainsaw with one hand. Not something an amateur needs to do. You can seriously get yourself cut and hurt one hand in one of these saws if you don't know what you're doing. But these usually are called, long handle saws, because the handle's in the back and you hold it with two hands. This can be held with two hands, but it can also be operated with one hand. They're smaller saws. What you get, if you look at the price of them, they're fairly expensive because they're made like the logger and arborist saws for an arborist to go out and use it day in and day out. They're not really considered homeowner saws because they last a lot longer than the lighter weight saws. But they're just saws that you can operate with one hand. They usually tie a rope around it, so when they're not using it, it's just hanging from their belt. well below their body for the safety thing on the thing. And they usually got about 12-inch bar on them because they're made to crawl up on top of a tree and cut limbs off. So it's a different kind of saw. You probably don't have need for one. Just be aware there's these in-tree saws are just kind of a different class of saw, but they're for very special purposes. So most likely you're going to need a homeowner style model which got 2 handholds on it rather than this single one. I had told you I would discuss a little bit about the very largest of the saws for logging and other purposes. This is my steel 660 that I've had now going on about 6 years. It's still running very well. Originally, I bought a 36-inch long bar for this, and it's been quite adequate for cutting trees. Well, about 5 years ago, me and a buddy decided to start cutting big, huge slabs out of some of these large trees. So we went and purchased this 60-inch wide Grandberg chainsaw mill. We originally put this steel 660 on this thing and started trying to cut oak and pecan logs. And we had a heck of a time. It just didn't have enough power. We had to seesaw the saw back and forth and just wait for it to cut because it just didn't have enough horsepower to drag. We're talking about 12 foot of chainsaw chain there that just having to drag around through an oak log. Also, this saw is set up for 3/8 chain, and these Grandberg mills come with 404 chain. That's the biggest saw chain you can get for regular use. Much heavier, bigger chain, so it creates more drag on your saw. So we tried this steel 660, and it just wasn't big enough. Now, this is a 36-inch bar. When we went out and purchased a steel 880, it come with a 41-inch bar, which I have cut down a total of 1 large 4-foot diameter tree with. And now I just usually cut it on both sides with this 660. Let me get it out of the way and then we'll talk some more about saws. What we got here is a 60-inch wide cut that I can do with slabs. It's being driven by a steel 880 Magnum, an 8-point, I think it's 2 horsepower saw. That's 8 horsepower machine there driving this thing. It's been adequate for what we've been doing, cutting 3 and 4 foot wide slabs. This motor is big enough. There's a video coming out about this thing in use. Hopefully that was helpful to give you a little insight into the higher level chainsaws that probably 2 or 3% of the total population will need for the kind of stuff they have. You just need the knowledge of from small to large is what I'm trying to do with this video, and give you a little insight into all those different sizes of saws. If you like this video, please subscribe. Helps us do future videos. Push the like button down there. Tell me you like it. Now, we've been talking about just about chainsaws on this video. The next video, this is a 3-part series. The next video, we're going out in the wood, we're going to cut trees. Once it's down the ground, we're going to limb it. We're going to show you how to use these saws correctly, how to do special cuts with them, what not to do. One of the big problems when you cut trees a lot is getting your saw hung up because you don't really take into account the stresses that are on a tree laying on the ground. So we're going to be doing a lot of teaching about how to not do stuff as well as how to use a saw, and it'll make it much more enjoyable for you as you use your saw to know those things. That particular video is going to be kind of long because there's a lot of information to cover. So when we finish the second video on how to use a saw, we're coming back in here and we're going to sharpen all these saws, and I'm going to show you how to maintain them to give them a long life. And so we're going to talk about maintenance and sharpening on the third video. So we look forward to seeing you on those. Stay tuned. We're going to be back with you sooner than later. Take care.